Hi, my name is Amanda DeGirolano, and I'm one of the speech-language pathologists at Springbrook Autism Behavioral Health. In this month's Family Enrichment, we're going to talk about current research and get some perspectives about communication as it pertains to autism. So, we'll be hearing from our experts in the field of autism. We'll also be identifying ways we can support children and adolescents on the spectrum and provide authentic communication between you and your child. So, let's get going. When I was a new speech-language pathologist working in a private practice right outside of DC, often I would have families come to me with their child and this brand new diagnosis of autism. They would be worried and concerned that their child wouldn't be like other kids when it came to communication, and they wanted their children to be like everybody else. Often you could hear the desperation in their voice as they looked for a way to fix their child. They would say things like, I just want them to talk. I want them to be able to have conversations. I want them to tell me when they have to go to the bathroom. I just want them to look at me. I want them to be like other kids. Why won't they listen? In the back of my mind, I wanted those things for the kids too. I wanted them to be able to function in the world and be able to understand body language. And I wanted them to be able to express their emotions and be able to empathize with others and see things from different perspectives. I realized that these conversations about autism were a bit one-sided. And ironically, they weren't really taking the child's perspective into account. Last month, Tisha shared that effective communicating consists of the ability to listen, understand, and respond to others. But according to current research, it's not just autistic people who are struggling to understand and respond. In fact, the research is showing that people with autism read autistic people pretty well, and neurotypical people are actually kind of bad at interpreting autistic behavior. It's that people with different ways of processing sensory information experience the world in different ways and struggle to relate to one another. So each of these people have different sensory systems, and that's making it hard for them to relate to one another. This is known as the double empathy problem. Considering how autistic and neurotypical people fare perceiving and understanding each other, there could be a failure of empathy in both directions. So, all of that time, I'm trying to teach empathy to these kids on the spectrum, whereas I'm not empathizing and looking at their perspectives. And I'm sure that's true of all of us. We're not taking into account the other side. Now, if we're going to talk about empathy, we have to kind of dive into that a little bit more and figure out what that is. So, empathy is the action of understanding, being aware of, or being sensitive to the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another person. So, when I'm teaching this to kids on the spectrum, or just like any kids in general, I give the analogy of putting on someone else's glasses. We want to look at the world through that other person's filter and being able to understand their point of view. Will we be able to completely understand? No, but we try our best and try to support the people that we care about the most. So I decided to reach out to some experts in the field of autism, which were the kids right here at Springbrook. I asked some teenagers here at Springbrook to share their perspectives. And the first question I asked was, what do you wish your family and others knew about being on the spectrum? And These kids gave me permission to share these responses, which were quite eye-opening, really. One person said, "We're not sick, we're normal." Another person said, "Sometimes I have more energy to communicate your way than other times. And when I don't, it usually has nothing to do with you. Other times I'm just tired of you and don't want to talk." You don't know the loneliness and the hardship that goes with it. Places will refuse you if you're on the spectrum. That's just heartbreaking. Already feeling rejected. It's not just a disease. It's not contagious. Just because we're different doesn't mean we can't be human. You can't just tell us to act a certain way just because it makes you feel better. So we can see that the kids that are close to us definitely have feelings and opinions about the subject of autism. And already they're starting to form these ideas about themselves. Most of the teens I spoke to had something to share. Many of them seemed frustrated, hurt, or misunderstood in some way. And why is that? People with autism often are encouraged to conform to social norms so that they appear less autistic. That's a lot of pressure. These kids that are closest to us are receiving this message that something is innately wrong with them and they have to fix it. Some of the other teens were so excited to share their point of view because they are rarely asked questions about their perceptions. Most of the time, they are told how to act socially and have the enormous weight of listening and learning how to act neurotypically. Why is that, though? Why is it that autistic people bear most of the social obligation to learn about neurotypical social norms? Why aren't there more neurotypical people learning about autism? Often we teach these social skills and language skills so that kids with autism can fit in and adjust to a neurotypical world. But is that fair? Should the entire communicative load be on them? I'm not saying that we shouldn't teach these skills, but rather, should autistic people carry the full burden of learning and communicating? When we are out and see someone who is a quadriplegic, we don't go up to that person and demand that they walk and move like us. Instead, we help them adjust to their current situation. We give them the support that they need. We help them get around. We help them to live as independently as they can. But there is little we can do to change the fact that they have limited mobility. We don't tell this person to pretend that they are a walking person because they're not. So why are we doing this for people on the spectrum? It's great that we're helping them learn and function independently, but why is it that we have such high expectations for them to walk, so to speak? They are different, and that's okay. This idea of taking on the persona of neurotypical people is called masking. And masking is a compensatory strategy to hide autistic behavior in order to appear neurotypical. So there are so many reasons that people would mask. Maybe they want to have a romantic relationship with someone who's neurotypical. Maybe they're being bullied at school and they want to hide their autistic traits so they don't get picked on. Perhaps they've just been told their entire life that they need to look neurotypical, and that's the goal. So kids on the spectrum may learn social cues from various forms of media, observe social interactions between the people around them, even monitor their own facial expressions and body language. They may even research social norms. But research is showing that autistic masking may cause mental health problems, including anxiety, depression, exhaustion, like a lack of identity. Who am I? And maybe even suicidal thoughts. It reduces the closeness in interpersonal relationships because they are constantly hiding their true selves. So the big question is, what is our role as caregivers and providers to help support these kids on the spectrum? And it comes down to education and support. So let's talk about who we are educating. It is so important to teach our adolescents on the spectrum about non-autistic behavior. It's what we've already been doing, but I think it's important that we continue to teach this so that we can promote that empathy and understanding of one another. And we need to help kids on the spectrum also understand themselves, understand and accept those differences, because they aren't like non-autistic people. They are unique and amazing the way they are. Now, it wouldn't be fair if we stopped right there and only educated the people on the spectrum. Instead, we also need to teach those who are neurotypical. And when I say neurotypical, I mean those that are not autistic. And we need to help them understand what autistic behavior looks like so that there isn't miscommunication, so there is more empathy toward the population, and so that they can best support and help those who have autism. More and more, we're seeing cases come up in the news where there is a misunderstanding by law enforcement or medical staff, and people on the spectrum are not getting the care and support that they need. So this is so big, and it's so important that our communities as a whole are educating themselves on how they can best support and come up beside those who have autism. So in addition to educating, how can we support those on the spectrum? What can we do? So when it comes to supporting, we want to listen and learn. So let's listen to autism. What does that look like? What does that sound like? So listening to autism involves looking at what autistic traits look like. Kids on the spectrum feel things in a different way than we do. They tend to be hyper or hyposensitive to sensory input and tend to have difficulties regulating their feelings. Now, if we go to Liberty Bridge and see what they have to say about this, one adolescent said, "I feel things differently. I like my face covered. I don't like slimy textures." So we can see that he feels things differently than neurotypical people. Then if we go to this person from Eden, they say that autism is less of a mental symptom and more of a psychological symptom. It changes the way we think and process the world. It changes the way that one can read the room or situations. Our perspectives are more solid than others. They have a lot more emotional memory and clarity, but the big thing is that the past seems present. Feelings are tenfold. This kid is so insightful and was able to so eloquently express his thoughts about autism. And what strikes me is this idea that feelings are tenfold. So often I see kids with autism overreacting, or what I think is overreacting, to sensory information. So like loud noises, visual input, different textures. And it's so easy to forget that they have feelings like us, and they experience those feelings on a more intense level. They may even remember an event like the event just happened and react as if it's happening in the present. So think about how you would want to be treated in these situations. There was one time I was working in a self-contained classroom with middle schoolers, and there was this one kid that was sitting there eating his lunch, just sitting there enjoying himself, and the teacher's assistant went up to him and told him that he was going to have to finish soon. Instead of giving him an appropriate amount of time to process that food was going to be put away, she snatched the food out of his hand. And of course, you can probably imagine what happened. He became irate and just over the top upset with this TA and began trying to hurt her, trying to hurt himself. Eventually, this kid had to be put in a restraint to keep him from hurting himself and hurting others. Now, was this reaction a bit over the top? Probably. But stop and consider what your reaction to something like this would have been. If someone took away my food, I know I would be pretty mad. And I have the capability of expressing, hey, give it back. But this kid, he did not have that ability. So he's communicating in the only way that he knows how. Plus, if we think about feelings being tenfold for those on the spectrum, then it stands to reason why this child would respond in such an intense way. Another trait of autism is stimming. Now, the word stimming refers to self-stimulating behaviors that involve repetitive movements and sounds. So we might see hand flapping, we might see a child saying a word over and over and over again because they like how it sounds, tapping their fingers on the table, and looking at something super closely. Kids on the spectrum use stimming for many reasons. Sometimes they use it when they're experiencing sensory overload. It helps them to calm down. It can help them adapt to unfamiliar environments. It can reduce anxiety. Maybe it can help them express frustrations if they're having trouble communicating effectively. And it can help them avoid certain activities or expectations sometimes. So it can also be an avoidance behavior. Let's see what some of the kids here at Springbrook had to say about stimming. You can focus a lot better with stimming. When I stim, I feel happy. It doesn't mean that I'm mad. Here at Springbrook, we try to allow kids to stim so that they can feel better in their environment and in their own skin. Another characteristic of autistic language development is echolalic speech. And a lot of people will assume that echolalia doesn't really have any meaning. The kid is just repeating the same words, phrases, sentences, whatever, over again to you, and it doesn't really have any meaning. But this is a misconception because a lot of times kids on the spectrum will use echolalia in order to develop their language. And this type of development is called Gestalt language development. And this type of language learning isn't isolated just to autism. It's also found that other people that are neurotypical are also using this way of gaining and understanding language. So let's look at what quote-unquote typical language development looks like. The early language model talks about single word utterances being learned first, and then taking those words and building upon them to make longer and more complex sentences. Whereas with Gestalt language development, the children are learning giant chunks of language at first. And since they're processing so much information, they eventually start breaking down those utterances into smaller pieces and use them in a more flexible way, and then eventually are able to break them down into smaller units, such as words. So these are just differences in language acquisition. One way is not better than the other way. We just see one more dominantly. Another characteristic of autistic communication includes info dumping and perseverating. So often you'll see a child who really wants to talk about trains or really wants to talk about maps and different foods. And they're really into it. They will research and learn all about these things to the point where they become an expert. This is a normal characteristic of children on the spectrum. So, how can we best support our autistic friends? Researchers suggest therapy should facilitate authentic autistic socializing, which means we need to stop teaching autistic kids that appearing neurotypical is the goal. So, what can we do? So, for nonverbal kids, I would allow for total communication. So, honoring those nonverbal prompts when they point to something, when they lead you to something, when they are trying to use single words to express themselves, when they are using signs. Let them communicate in a way they feel comfortable. Provide options for alternative communication. Try picture communication and AAC. Try sign language. Try less questioning and more modeling. Kids on the spectrum, they tend to repeat those things, the things that you say to them over and over. So if we're using echolalic speech, we want to model what speech looks like and what communication looks like, and give kids on the spectrum ways they can express themselves. So model how to express their needs, how to express their likes, their dislikes, their emotions, whatever. And when you do hear echolalia, try to respond like it's intentional, because it might be. They might be trying to use a phrase in the context of the situation. So try to figure it out and try to relate it back to what's happening in the present moment. Next, for nonverbal kids, try scaffolding. If you do have a kid that is using longer sentences, model something slightly different than what they've been using. So if they are using the phrase, "Let's go, mommy, let's go, mommy, let's go, mommy," we can change it up. Like, where are we going? Let's go to the park. Let's go home. Let's go to the grocery store. Try adding more to it. Or, who are we going with? Let's go with Daddy. Let's go with Aunt Jean. Let's go with whomever. So there's different ways to approach it, trying to add a little bit more so that they can fully express themselves. When it comes to children who are verbal, encourage different communication styles. Allow info dumping. If a child wants to go off and tell you all about trains and planes and whatever, let them do that. Give them the opportunity to do that. But also, let's teach them conversational speech as well, so that they can interact with their peers. It's important to learn different types of communication and how neurotypical people tend to stay on topic, whereas someone on the spectrum might bounce around from topic to topic, even going back to topics. It's normal. It's kind of what we do. Plus, language is always morphing and changing. So let's be sensitive. And lastly, let's allow for alternative communication. So when kids are tired or overwhelmed, let them relax and not talk if it's too much. allow for quiet or allow for them to use picture communication. Just because they're verbal doesn't mean that they can't be overwhelmed by a situation and not want to talk. All right, so when it comes to support, it's also important to provide safety. So we want to support successful interactions that are positive, joyful, and mutually beneficial so that all people can strengthen shared systems of communication and interactions. This is also important so that people in the community can know how to interact and appropriately serve our friends on the spectrum. And last, let's accept them. Autistic people may benefit from programs that help them to socialize in more authentically autistic ways, but only if their autistic social behavior is met with understanding and acceptance from non-autistic people. People on the spectrum need to feel safe that they can behave in a way that is purely autistic and not receive backlash or even ridicule from their peers and colleagues. So this is the end of our presentation. Here I have some resources on masking, stimming, what Gestalt language development looks like in a more in-depth look. And then we also have autistic communication strategies and how you can support your child on the spectrum. Here I have also the references that I used in this presentation. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Also, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to work with your children. It truly is a privilege and an honor.